right, so that's all done now. And if we scrub it, we can see our confusing looking, compressed thing, but it's still correct either way. Yeah, so let's convert this into a surface. Before we actually make it into a proper surface, we'll still use the particle fluid surface, but let's take a look at this. Let's see what the particles look like. That's kind of how we've been seeing it in the sim. So make a particle fluid surface, convert to particles, and turn on the visualize velocity, like so. And it will kind of turn this back into, again, the kind of manner that we've been used to seeing it. You can see it's got way more detail now, obviously, and way more of these kind of streaming liquid things, the fan that I've talked about. That's what I've been calling this here. So that's pretty cool seeing that. So that was clearly a success. And now to actually surface that. The surfacing, as you've seen in other lessons, is going to take a little while too. It's not a sim, but it still is a slow process, especially with more particles. So to begin with, make another particle fluid surface. This time don't connect it yet. What's it doing? Okay, I must have left something on. I left the tank on. Go to the controls, get the particle separation. I spelled separation wrong. Oops, I do that all the time. So we'll connect that to this one here. So paste absolute references, and now we can hook that in. I'm actually going to start maybe on frame 24, where we won't have to take as long to surface because there won't be as much to surface. But I do want to see something. So I don't want to start on the very, very first frame of it just being flat. Okay, that should be it. And there you go. So we're off to the races. Right off the bat, I would say we have a box here. All I want is for the thin surface. I'll recreate my own box essentially later on, but for now I just want to see the flat surface. So go into manual mode so it doesn't keep updating while we do this, and go to our tank setup and say, and then the regions here in the particle fluid surface say use bounding box. The bounding box should be the size and the center, or at least it will be more or less. If we look at that now, we will see it'll chop off most of what we wanted to chop off. But remember, we also had the boundary layer. The boundary layer is around each side, and the boundary layer doesn't really represent exactly what we want. If we come back to looking at this, it has this kind of column here, because that's the particles that are constantly being replaced. So we don't really need to surface that necessarily either. So based on the fact that our boundary layer here is 0.75 on each side, we can knock that either out entirely by literally binding 0.75 maybe times 2, or subtract the lower and upper, both minus this. I'm just going to wing it and say, let's just subtract some distance off of the side. And if we have a problem, we can make it more accurate. But I don't want to delete so much on the sides if I don't have to. In fact, we may not even really necessarily need to delete any of this at all. In fact, I think I might just change my mind on this entirely. Might just say, this is one of those instances where it's to be the most accurate, you technically probably should subtract the boundary layers from the sides. But I'm going to say in this case, let's not even. Because I do want to have some real estate on the side to do this next thing, which is flatten geometry. I'll leave you with this. If you are noticing the boundary layer in your surface results, and again, I don't really see it here, I'm not seeing anything untoward, then I would say subtract it out. If you don't, just leave it. Flattened geometry is the more important thing here. Flattened geometry will say whatever heights there are along the edges of our surface geometry, flatten them down to the waterline. Flatten them down to, at least by default, y equals 0. This is important because the flattened geometry knows that what you're probably going to do is blend this back into the ocean. And remember, the ocean geometry is a flat plane, so we want to match that. The ocean geometry's flat plane will be displaced at render time, and we're going to apply the same displacement onto all of this flat area, even on our flip stuff too. So we need it to literally blend into it. I mean, to put it more practically, here's our render ocean infinite exterior, or yeah, and that's what we want. We want this to, you know, come down into it, even if there are waves and whatnot. So there you go. Looks like we actually do have a little bit of problem here. So like I was saying, I guess we should subtract out a little bit from the sides. Put this onto manual again, because we don't want to have to wait for it to do a complete new resurface every time we change one parameter. When you're in manual mode, you can either just switch back to auto update, or you can click on this little refresh thing down here. Cool. So there you go. So now we've deleted out more from the edge, so those extra little artifacts are now gone. So the flattened geometry, as I was saying, will basically do all this stuff under the hood that usually works. A lot of people find when they use the ocean tools, especially with this, the flattened geometry can be buggy. And one of the main bugs comes from this rebuild STF thing. I would just say to you right now, go ahead and turn it off. It doesn't really improve results that much, so turn it off. It makes the flattening faster, and it makes it less buggy. We do want to output a flattened attribute. That is literally an attribute called flattened, as you can see here. We'll use that later in our compositing. We're going to turn this into the alpha, essentially, of our image, and we'll use that to blend it smoothly back to the overall infinite ocean. You'll see that working later. We might want to have some more flattened distance, so put it to 2. And I'm going to say for pad bounds, it will add more to the outside. This is nice because if we don't do it, and we look at our flattened attributes, it doesn't even quite necessarily get to 1. It does get to 0, but not quite to 1. And it's getting more flattened towards the edges. So that's where we want it to completely transition to being completely flat, meaning completely transparent, essentially in our alpha. Somehow I got into... it's freaking out. Okay. So what else we need to do? I want to say pad the bounds to actually give it more time to get all the way to flattened equals 1. So 0 to 1 entirely. You see that going on? Weird stuff. Anyway, let's trust that it's still working. Again, I feel like Adene's going to crash any second now. That looks right. This doesn't look right. I'm going to go into this mode. All right, well, if you'll excuse that for a minute. As usual, if you're ever getting viewport problems, usually you can go destroy the scene view itself and make a new one, and that usually will fix it. Oh, there we go. So hide other objects, and there you go. Oh, we can keep the other objects, who cares? Okay, so we're back. So what else we need to do? If we were to choose a later frame, let's say, I'll just go to the last frame, which is going to be the biggest geometry. Now we're going to tie back into what we talked about earlier, which is the displacement issue of having too many polygons. We have a fairly high-res sim, so we're going to have a fairly high amount of polygons. So what we're going to need to do is use the surfacer's adaptivity parameter once this finishes up, and that will allow us to preserve the shape pretty well, but use way less polygons to do it. So I'm going to let this finish here real quick. So there you go. So lots of stuff going on in here. But again, it's taking up 2.5 million points anyway. It's just one primitive because it's a polygon soup, and that's just a kind of Houdini thing where you don't need to store attributes per primitive. So it just is technically one primitive, but all points, whatever. If it makes it easier to visualize, we'll just put a convert after it, which we're gonna have to do later anyway. And you can see it's 2.7 million primitives. So it's gonna be way too many for us to apply displacement to later on. Even if we only want the displacement in the flat areas, it's still gonna have to consider everything potentially having displacement. So go to here, back to the particle fluid surface, and then go to adaptivity and go all the way from 0.005 to 0.5. That's a very high amount, but look how much polygons there are less now. And now it's only 500,000 primitives. So it's decreased it by 80%. And it essentially looks the same. Again, if I go back to this and just look at your screen, you'll see it change. It really doesn't look much different. It's still smart about where it's removing polygons, so a lot of the flatter areas. Cool. So that's pretty much it for the particle surfacer. I'll say real quick that typically we like to use things like final smooth and whatnot, but final smooth is going to cause a lot of jittering in these sparse areas. From frame, any given frame will look nice with a smooth on, but frame by frame, some of these little like pockets and holes will fill up and open and fill up and open from frame to frame as the smooth is applied, and it's not going to look very good. So I'm going to say go into manual for a second, grab the compressed thing above here, put it here. Again, I go into manual because I don't want it to have to load the compressed thing again, and just call this surface. And let's cache this. This is going to take a while, and it'll be nice to have this all cached out. I don't have to think about it anymore. Okay, and here we go.